Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my Saturday Hodgepodge. I think this is Hodgepodge number 40 now. This is just a weekly video where I talk about reading, my YouTube viewing habits, stuff from my life, and sometimes some shout-outs. I have some of those things for you today. Obviously, if you live in the United States of America, if you're following news about the United States of America, you know that what's occupying most of our times, a lot of our kind of headspace is what's going on in the United States in relationship to the police in Minneapolis, Minnesota, murdering an African-American man by kneeling on his neck for almost 9 minutes. George Floyd's death has set off a convulsion of protests and anger across the United States. Which I have to be honest with you, I feel that our police forces are handling worse and worse as we go along, and that the President of the United States is completely absent from. So I can't, do a video in which I talk about, what's been going on in my life and what's going on and what I'm thinking without talking about this. So what I decided to do, since I'm a recently retired history teacher, is to give a history lesson. And specifically, I want to give a history lesson which explains how we got to where we are. So for me, and I think this is probably true for most people who really are interested in history, the reason history is important is that it helps us understand why. The why is the important question for history. Why did things happen? But really importantly to me is, why are things the way they are today? How did we get where we are? So if you'll indulge me for just a few minutes, hopefully I'll be able to get through this quickly, and I'll move on to some other bookish talk today too, because I do want to do that as well. It is important, I think. So the history lesson I want to teach is the history of the United States between the Civil War and modern day, and the modern day United States of America in terms of race relations. I think most people around the world and in the United States are aware that for a long period of time, the United States was one of the world's largest practitioners of slavery. That African people were enslaved, kidnapped from their home countries in Africa, brought to the United States, forced into labor, deprived of freedom, deprived of the very basic human rights, oftentimes treated incredibly physically cruelly, psychologically cruelly, and deprived of all those things, and that essentially came to an end with the American Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But what a lot of people, I think, are unaware of is the transition that took place after the Civil War. So the Civil War was about racism, and you can argue with me in the notes if you want to below, but you're wrong. The Civil War was about racism. It was about slavery. The Southern states seceded to protect the institution of slavery. There are all kinds of economic and racist reasons for that, but I just want to mention something else about racism, about slavery, that is de-emphasized, which is a big part of the story in this history lesson I want to tell you today, and that is that slavery was about control. Most white Southerners didn't own slaves. Some 75% of white Southerners owned no slaves at the time of the Civil War, but they all supported the institution of slavery for racist reasons, for economic reasons, but also for this control reason. In lots of Southern states, after the African American population, the enslaved population, was 35–40% of the state's population, and as that enslaved population grew, the white population became more and more fearful of that African American population, and slavery was a way to maintain control. So when the Civil War came to an end, white Southerners were desperately fearful of what would happen in their states and their communities because they were racist. They were fearful of what would happen. And they created a new system, a system that came about after the end of Reconstruction, which sometimes we refer to as Jim Crow, and oftentimes we apply the label of segregation to. So generally speaking, when somebody says segregation in the United States, I think the images we get in our mind are of those pictures of, the separate water fountains and the sign over the door that says, colored entrance or something like that. And what oftentimes then people think is that segregation was about separating the races. It was about physically separating African Americans from white Americans, and they accept that that was an inherently racist idea. But if you believe segregation was about separation, then you are really buying into the white Southern myth about what they were really doing, because what segregation was really about was control. It was a system of laws, which we refer to as Jim Crow laws, that essentially gave white people control over the lives of African American people, told them where they could go to school, told them where they could live, what door they had to enter in through, where they had to sit. It was about control. And proof that segregation wasn't about separation is that well-to-do white families had African Americans living in their homes, working in their homes, that white employers hired African Americans and worked to work side by side with them. It wasn't about separation. It was about control. That's what those segregation laws were all about, was that control. That gave legal control to white Southerners over African Americans in the years between about 1876 and, let's say, 1964, where at least those kind of laws had to come to an end slowly, but they did. That's the kind of legal control, the political control. Or economic control was enforced through a process called sharecropping. Most African Americans who lived in the South at the end of the Civil War, their skills were mostly farming skills. They didn't own land, so they couldn't farm, so they had to go to work on the farms of white landowners, many of whom had been their former owners. This kind of sharecropping system is a form of debt peonage, in which the person who was the sharecropper, the African American person in this case, always finds himself in more debt to the landowner, so essentially the landowner is establishing or able to extract free labor from the African American person who is their sharecropper. This creates a permanent underclass of African Americans who are impoverished, who are always in debt, and who can't escape that system. That's economic control. And then social control was maintained through the process of lynching. So there was a debate, believe it or not, a Republican congressman named Rand Paul held up a resolution in the Senate just yesterday that was trying to, make lynching a federal crime. But lynching was a part of social control. Now, when we think of lynching, we primarily think of someone being hung. And that's usually the form that lynching took, but it doesn't have to take the form of actual hanging. Because what lynching was a way in which the white community in the South terrorized the African American community. It was about terrorism. And African American men were almost always the victims of these lynchings. And they were usually the victims of the lynching for overstepping some of those segregationist laws or lines that had been established. So notice, African American men are the victims of lynching for violating segregationist rules, for violating the laws put in place to give white Americans control over African Americans. And those lynchings were public. And those lynchings were terrible. And the entire white community oftentimes turned out to watch the African American person be killed. Photographs were taken. White people had their picture taken with the bodies of the African American man who had been lynched. Usually before the actual hanging took place, the African American man was taken by a mob someplace and beaten and tortured before the actual killing took place. And then they were brought to a public place, usually a town square, and they were hung or killed in public, and the entire white community turned out to watch this lynching. And by doing so, what the white community was saying is, we approve of this, that we think this is okay, that this is what we think should be done. And that is a form of terrorism. They were trying to terrorize the African American community into following the rules. Now, think about everything I just said about the history of lynching in the United States, and about how lynching and segregation were all about control, and think about what's going on in the United States of America today. Today we have a term called extrajudicial killing. An extrajudicial killing, I looked up the definition, is when someone is killed either by some kind of government official or by private individuals who claim they are attempting to enforce the law, but that killing takes place without a trial, without a jury, without any kind of criminal procedure. Now I want you to think about what happened to George Floyd. Was he the victim of an extrajudicial killing? Yes. Was he the victim of an extrajudicial killing at the hands of a white man? Yes. Did white men sit around and watch it happen? Yes. By doing so, did they condone what was happening? Yes. All those things are true, and if you notice, all those things are what I said about lynching. One of the unfortunate truths is that in the period during segregation and at the end of legalized segregation, the police oftentimes took over the role of enforcing what remained of these segregationist codes. An extrajudicial killing is just another term for murder. An extrajudicial killing of African American men by white men who are trying to enforce some kind of code, like the two racist psycho murderers who killed the African American man for jogging through a white neighborhood. They are, in fact, those killings are, in fact, lynchings. I think that's an important background to understand where we are and why there is this outrage in the African American community and in other communities of other people about what happened to George Floyd, because it is one in a long and awful history of lynchings, of murders of African American men at the hands of people with authority, of white people with authority. So I wanted to make sure I give you that little history lesson to kind of understand what I think is the important historical background to what's going on and why so many people are now demanding a change. Why so many, white people and people who are not people of color are now hopefully standing up in an alliance with African American people and saying, we will not tolerate these lynchings anymore. We won't tolerate the term extrajudicial killing as a way of excusing or making murder of African American men at the hands of people in authority seem less horrible. Okay, so there you go. There's my lesson for today. I did want to also just kind of recommend two books, I think, as a lot of booktubers I've been seeing are doing, about the African American experience in dealing with the police and in modern society. The first one of those is, real quickly, is Breathe, A Letter to My Sons by Imani Perry. I read this in February as a part of my BookTube Prize judging. And this basically is a book by Imani Perry, who is a noted scholar in African American studies and in other areas, in which she's essentially writing this book as a letter to her sons, her two teenage African American sons, about her hopes for them, her fears, what she hopes she remembers. Now, I ranked this as the 5th best book in my group of 6 in the octafinals round of the BookTube Prize. That doesn't mean it's not a very good book. I'm afraid I was too dismissive of it because the book is so personal, and because the book is a lot about her own sons. I didn't feel like its reach was all that universal. But in thinking back on everything that's happened since then, I probably should have I should have recognized that her expressions of fear and pain and hope weren't specific. They are universal, and I think this is a very good book. If you can get your hands on it today, I think it's worth reading. And then also, my favorite person to go to and to get wisdom from and understanding from and try to learn from is still James Baldwin. And so I just want to point out that this book, If Beale Street Could Talk, by James Baldwin, is oftentimes kind of promoted as sort of a love story, a Romeo and Juliet story about how this young African-American couple is separated by the wrongful imprisonment of the young man whose name was Fonny. But I also want to point out that this book, which was written back in the 50s or early 60s, is an example of exactly the kind of prejudice and racism African Americans have been facing at the hands of the police for a long time. And that, it was chilling to me to think about all the ways in which the interactions between the main African American character, Fonny, and the police are described here, and how similar they seem to be to what's going on in the United States of America today. So I did want to recommend those two books to you. Also, I have completed some of my reading for Pride Month. Oh, geez. Sorry, Zelda. Right on top of the head. I did read the graphic memoir Fun Home by Alison Bechtel, in which she basically describes her relationship with her difficult, in-the-closet father, her own kind of realization that she was, in fact, a lesbian, and her kind of exploration of non-gender normative dressing and things like that. And I thought this was a really effective, frank, a lot more, a lot deeper kind of reading experience than I thought it would be. I think this was really good. And if you haven't read it, I may be the last person not to have read it. If you haven't read it, then you should. This also was helps me with kind of read more genres because it is a graphic novel. I just finished Magic for Liars by Sarah Gailey. Sarah Gailey is the author of the Hippo Duology, which I just loved. And in this book, they attempted to write a kind of a detective story set at a magical school. This book isn't bad, it's just not particularly good. It doesn't, to me, have the magic, the spark, the innovation, the fun of that Hippo Duology book. If you're ever going to read Sarah Gailey, and I think you should read the Hippo Duology, please read the Hippo Duology. Two books about alternative history in which there are feral hippos in Louisiana and people who ride them and herd them. I thought that was much better. This is not... Anyway, this wasn't a bad book, just not a great book. And I also started reading just yesterday. I barely made any headway in it. House on Endless Waters by Amina Elon. It's a book I'm buddy reading with Britta Bowler, and we have our first check-in in a couple of days. And so I need to get on with reading that, but that's what I've been reading. Also, YouTube-wise, I've been watching, or I should guess I just say internet-wise, I've been watching a lot of Shakespeare plays since I did the Shakespeare tag, and before. I had several commenters. I think Tilly made me aware of the Twelfth Night being available for free to watch from the National Theatre in England, England's National Theatre, the British National Theatre. I watched that. Last night I watched Coriolanus from the same theater company. Someone also made me aware that the Globe was offering free videos of Shakespeare productions they put on. I watched The Winter's Tale, which I enjoyed. I watched a version, I watched Macbeth, which I didn't think it was as good, even though I loved that play. And so I've been watching a lot of Shakespeare. I still have The Merry Wives of Windsor to watch from the Globe, which I plan on getting to this weekend. That has been, you know, a bit of a distraction and something I've really been enjoying by watching on YouTube. So I also wanted to shout out a new channel I found just the other day after she was kind enough to leave a comment on one of my videos, and that's Kay the Reader. Please go check out her channel. She's got a lot of videos and not nearly enough subscribers. I'll leave a link to her channel down below. Anyway, there you go. That's my Saturday Hodgepodge for today. As always, thank you for watching.